Every morning for nearly 30 years, a 6'4" man in a well tailored suit would step onto the Long Island Railroad at Massapequa Park. He looked like any other executive heading into the city, carrying a leather briefcase, checking his watch, and blending into the sea of thousands of commuters flowing into Midtown Manhattan. His name was Rex Heuermann. He was a successful architectural consultant with an office just blocks from the Empire State Building. He was a man who spent his days obsessing over the New York City building codes, structural integrity, and the minute details of urban design. He was an expert at navigating the most complex bureaucracies in the world. But as the sun set over the Long Island Sound, the architect was drawing up a very different kind of blueprint. For over a decade, a remote stretch of coastline known as Gilgo Beach had been the site of a mystery that paralyzed the East Coast. Between 1993 and 2010, at least 11 sets of human remains were discovered along Ocean Parkway, some wrapped in heavy camouflage burlap, others discarded in a dense brush. The killer was a ghost. He was someone who knew how to avoid cameras, how to use burner phones, and how to vanish into the millions of people in the New York metropolitan area. The Gilgo Beach serial killer became a modern legend, a hunter who seemed to understand the forensic gaps of the local police. For 13 years, the trail was cold. The world thought the killer had either died or moved on, but the truth was far more disturbing. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was still taking the train. He was still attending city council meetings. He was still living in the same cluttered house in Massapequa Park where he kept a vault filled with over 200 firearms. The loop that finally broke this case wasn't a witness or a confession. It was a single, careless moment in Midtown Manhattan involving a discarded pizza box. This is the story of Rex Heuermann, the architect of Gilgo Beach. It is a descent into the mind of a man who believed that if you plan a crime with the same precision you used to build a skyscraper, you can get away with anything. We're going to look at the digital breadcrumbs he thought he had erased, the planning document for murders found in his computer, and the forensic miracle that finally turned a piece of discarded trash into a life sentence. To the world at large, Rex Heuermann was a definition of stability. He was the founder of RH Consultants and Associates, an architectural firm located on Fifth Avenue in the heart of Manhattan. If you were a developer trying to get a project through the rigorous New York City building department, Rex was your guy. He was known for being a meticulous technician, someone who understood the rules so well that he knew exactly how to work around them. But as he stepped off the train in Massapequa Park each night, the pristine world of blue chip consulting disappeared. Rex lived in a house that neighbors described as a dungeon. It was a small, dilapidated red shingled home that stood in stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the quiet suburban street. It was a place of hoarding and decay, a messy reality that hid behind a clean image of a Fifth Avenue architect. Inside that house, police would later discover a massive walk in vault reinforced by a heavy steel door containing over 200 firearms and a collection of dark, disturbing digital materials. This duality, the precision of an architect and the hoarding of a predator, between 2007 and 2010, the Gilgo Ford disappeared. These were four young women: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lim Costello. Like the victims of the serial killers we've covered before, these women were vulnerable. They were sex workers who used Craigslist to meet clients, a digital platform that gave Rex the anonymity he craved. Rex treated his hobby with the same analytical coldness he applied to city building codes. He didn't just pick up women, he studied the terrain. He chose Gilgo Beach because it was a remote and accessible only by a long, lonely highway. He understood the jurisdiction gaps between local and state police. He believed that by targeting women who operated in the shadows of the internet, he was building a wall of silence that no investigator could ever climb. But the architect made one fundamental mistake. He assumed that because the world saw him as a professional, they would never look at him as a suspect. He believed his briefcase and his suit were an impenetrable shield. He didn't realize that in the digital age, even the most meticulous planning leaves a ghost in the machine. The story of Rex Heuermann doesn't begin with his arrest in 2023. It begins on a cold, panicked night in May 2010 in the gated community of Oak Beach. A young woman named Shannon Gilbert made a frantic 23-minute call to 911. She was terrified, screaming that they were trying to kill her. She vanished into the marshland that night, sparking a missing persons search that would inadvertently pull back the curtain on decades of darkness. As investigators combed through the thick, salt sprayed brush along Ocean Parkway looking for Shannon, instead, they found something much more systematic. On December 11, 2010, a police canine unit caught a scent. Tucked away in the brambles, just feet from the road, they found the skeletal remains of a woman wrapped in heavy, camouflaged burlap. 2 days later, they found three more. These four women, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, became known as the Gilgo Four. They had all disappeared between 2007 and 2010. They were all petite, all in their 20s, and all had worked as sex workers. The precision with which they were placed, spaced nearly exactly 500 feet apart, suggested this wasn't the work of a disorganized predator. This was a managed site. The discovery sent shockwaves through New York, but the horror was only beginning. By the spring of 2011, the body count along that single stretch of highway rose to 10. The remains included an Asian man and a toddler, suggesting that the Gilgo Beach serial killer was far more versatile and prolific than anyone had imagined. But then, the investigation hit a wall, or rather, a series of walls. For the next decade, the case was plagued by local department scandals, changes in leadership, and a frustrating lack of forensic progress. The architect had built a perfect mystery. He had used burner phones from crowded areas like Penn Station and the Port Authority to lure his victims, making the cell tower pings almost impossible to isolate. He had made taunting calls to the families of his victims, but he kept them short, less than 3 minutes, knowing exactly how much time he had before the police could triangulate his position. While the families held vigils on the beach and the media speculated about a police connection to the crimes, Rex Heuermann continued his commuter lifestyle. He sat in his Fifth Avenue office, designed luxury spaces, and lived in a quiet suburb of Massapequa Park. He watched the news, saw the sketches of the suspect, and likely smiled. He had navigated the most complex building codes in Manhattan. He clearly believed he had successfully navigated the code of murder. But the buildup was reaching its peak. In 2022, a new multi-agency task force was formed with a singular focus. It used every modern digital tool available to find the ghost of Gilgo, and they started by looking at a car that a witness had mentioned over a decade ago, a vehicle that had been sitting in Rex's driveway the entire time. For over a decade, the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders was a masterclass in frustration. The killer seemed to possess an uncanny understanding of police tactics. He knew that if he used a burner phone, he had to do it in a crowded place where his signal would be lost among thousands of others. He knew that if he made a taunting call to a victim's family, he had to keep it under 3 minutes to avoid triangulation. He was a ghost in a suit, commuting to Manhattan every day while police chased shadows. But in 2022, a new multi-agency task force was formed, and they decided to stop looking for a monster and start looking for a pattern. They began by re-examining the digital footprint of the burner phones used to contact the victims in 2010. By cross-referencing the cell phone pings, they discovered a chilling geographical overlap. The burner phones were consistently being used in two very specific locations: Midtown Manhattan near Madison Square Garden and Massapequa Park on Long Island. Suddenly, the ghost had a commute. The task force started looking for a man who lived in Massapequa and worked in Midtown, but New York is a city of millions. They needed a narrower filter. That's when they went back to a witness report from 2010 that had been buried in the files for years. A witness had seen a man driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche around the time Amber Lynn Costello disappeared. When investigators ran a search for registered Chevrolet Avalanches in the Massapequa Park area, one name jumped off the screen: Rex Heuermann. The conflict was no longer about finding a suspect. It was about proving he was the one. The task force began a massive, secret surveillance operation. They watched Rex as he walked onto the train, he sat in his office, and as he browsed the internet. What they found on his digital devices was a descent into madness. Rex wasn't just searching for news about the Gilgo Beach case. He was using a series of burner email accounts to search for horrific, graphic material. He was looking up torture porn, snuff films, and most chillingly, he was searching for photos of the victims and their families. He was obsessed with the very tragedy he had created. But the most damning piece of digital evidence was a document recovered from his computer that investigators believe was a planning document for murder. It wasn't a diary, it was a blueprint. It contained a list of supplies to buy, notes on how to avoid DNA detection, and a section on how to prepare a site. It was the work of an architect applying his professional skills to the act of serial killing. Despite all this, the police still lacked one thing they needed to make an arrest: a direct physical link. Rex had been careful for 13 years. He didn't leave fingerprints, and he didn't leave his own DNA at the crime scenes, or so he thought. He didn't realize that a single hair from his wife's hairbrush, snagged on the burlap used to wrap a victim, was waiting for the technology to catch up. And he certainly didn't realize that a quick lunch in Midtown Manhattan was about to become his final act as a free man. By early 2023, the Gilgo Beach task force had done what three previous administrations couldn't. They had trapped a ghost in a digital box. They had the cell tower pings, the Chevrolet avalanche, and the disturbing search history. But they knew that a man like Rex Heuermann, a professional who understood the law and the weight of evidence, would never confess. They needed a direct biological link that would hold up in a New York courtroom. The surveillance team began following Rex as he left his Fifth Avenue office for his lunch break. On January 26, 2023, Rex walked out of his building and stopped at a trash can on the sidewalk. He tossed away a discarded pizza box from a nearby pizzeria. As soon as Rex was out of sight, an undercover officer moved in. Inside that box was a particularly eaten pizza crust. It was the same forensic gambit that had taken down the Grim Sleeper years earlier. The crust was rushed to the lab, where technicians extracted the DNA and compared it to a mitochondrial sample taken from a male hair found on the burlap used to wrap the body of Megan Waterman back in 2010. The result was a match. The architect was no longer just a suspect. He was the primary target of a first-degree murder investigation. On July 13, 2023, the hammer finally dropped. Rex Heuermann was intercepted by plainclothes officers on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He stood there, 6'4" and 270 pounds, looking like a confused executive as the handcuffs were tightened around his wrist. While Rex was being processed, a massive tactical team was descending on his home in Massapequa Park. For 12 days, investigators in white hazmat suits tore the dungeon house apart. Neighbors watched in horror as police hauled out over 200 firearms, a walk-in vault, and a massive amount of digital evidence. The most staggering discovery wasn't just the weapons, it was the planning document found on his computer. It wasn't a diary or a letter, it was a cold, clinical checklist. It detailed how to prepare a victim, how to avoid leaving DNA, and how to manage a dump site. It was the final proof that Rex hadn't just killed these women, he had designed their deaths with the same precision he used to design buildings. The climax of the investigation revealed that Rex may have been active for much longer than anyone realized. Since his arrest, he had been charged with additional murders, including that of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla, dating back as far as 1993. The East Coast boogeyman wasn't a shadow. He was a man who lived a full, professional life while hiding a body count that may eventually rival the most prolific killers in history. The architect's blueprint had finally collapsed. The Fifth Avenue office was empty, the Massapequa house was a crime scene, and the man who thought he was too smart for the system was finally facing a reality he couldn't plan his way out of. The arrest of Rex Heuermann wasn't just a victory for forensic science, it was a jolt to the system for everyone who lives in the shadow of New York City. For 13 years, the Gilgo Beach case was treated like an unsolvable ghost story, but as the details of the architect's life began to emerge, the public started asking a very uncomfortable question. How was he missed for so long? Investigators had a witness description of his first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche in 2010. They had cell tower pings that pointed directly to the Midtown to Massapequa commute. They even had the taunting phone calls made from the very area where Rex worked. Yet, for over a decade, the case sat in a state of frustrating inertia while Rex continued his daily routine. This leads to a question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you believe the delay in catching the Gilgo Beach killer was a result of Rex's meticulous planning and professional mask, or was it a failure of the local authorities who may have overlooked these victims because of their lifestyle? If the Gilgo Four hadn't been sex workers, do you think that the task force would have found that Chevrolet Avalanche 10 years sooner? And then there's the evidence from his computer, the literal planning document for murder. But Rex treated murder like a construction project. He had a list of supplies, notes on avoiding DNA, and strategies for preparation. Does the idea of a planning document make a killer more terrifying to you? But what do you call a man who treats a human life like a building code violation, something to be managed and disposed of with professional efficiency? The search of Rex's home also uncovered over 200 guns in a reinforced vault. Many investigators believe we've only seen the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his true victim count. Do you think Rex Heuermann is responsible for all 11 bodies found at Do you think Rex Heuermann is responsible for all 11 bodies found at Gilgo, or are we looking at multiple predators who use the same stretch of highway? I want to see your theories. This case is still active, and every new search of the Long Island brush brings up more questions. Let's get into it in the comments. The arrest of Rex Heuermann wasn't just a victory for forensic science, it was a jolt to the system for everyone who lives in the shadow of New York City. For 13 years, the Gilgo Beach case was treated like an unsolvable ghost story. But as the details of the architect's life began to emerge, the public started asking a very uncomfortable question. How was he missed for so long? Investigators had a witness description of his first generation Chevrolet Avalanche in 2010. It had cell tower pings that pointed directly to the Midtown to Massapequa commute. They even had the taunting phone calls made from the very area where Rex worked. Yet, for over a decade, the case sat in a state of frustrating inertia while Rex continued his daily routine. Rex Heuermann currently sits in a jail cell at Riverhead, awaiting a trial that promises to be one of the most complex in New York City history. Since his initial arrest for the Gilgo 4, the scope of the case has exploded. In June 2024, prosecutors added new charges, linking him to the 1993 murder of Sandra Costilla and the 2003 murder of Jessica Taylor. The architect's timeline of violence wasn't a 3-year spree, it was a 30-year career. As the forensic teams continued to dig through the dungeon house and analyze the hundreds of electronic devices seized in the raid, the world is beginning to see the true face of Rex Heuermann. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a man who hid behind a briefcase in a building permit, banking on the idea that society would never look for a monster in a Fifth Avenue office. But the legacy of the Gilgo Beach investigation isn't just about Rex Heuermann. It's about a shift in how we solve cold cases. The breakthrough didn't come from a sudden confession or a lucky break. It came from the relentless, decades-long persistence of investigators who refused to let the Gilgo 4 be forgotten. It came from the convergence of old school witness reports and cutting edge DNA sequencing, the same pizza crust technology that finally unmasked a man who thought he was invisible. The architect lived life by the code, the New York City building code, the social code of a suburban father, and his own twisted code of murder. But in the end, he forgot the most basic rule of structural integrity. If there is a single flaw in the foundation, the entire building will eventually come down. For Rex Heuermann, that flaw was a discarded pizza box in a single strand of hair. The story of Gilgo Beach is finally moving toward a conclusion. The families who spent 13 years screaming into the void are finally being heard. And as the trial begins, the man who spent his life designing spaces for others will finally be confined to a space he can never leave. If you want to stay updated on the Heuermann trial and other cases where modern forensics are cracking the world's most difficult mysteries, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're going to be following this case every step of the way. And if you're ready for another deep dive, click the video on screen right now.